The tweezers trembled in her hand as something black and worm-like emerged from the child's ear, and the Mafia boss's daughter, who had never spoken in 10 years, opened her mouth and whispered a word that would shatter everything. "Papa?" Dear readers, this isn't just a story about a miracle. This is about a pregnant woman who dared to see what others refused to believe. A father whose empire of fear couldn't protect his only daughter from silence, and a darkness that lived where innocence should have been. In the glass courtyard of Bell Industries, beneath the watchful shadows of armed bodyguards, Annabelle Milton knelt beside 10-year-old Karen Bell. Her medical training told her to stop. Her conscience told her to look away. But her trembling hands, one still resting protectively on her swollen belly, held steady as she pulled the impossible from the impossible. The child's scream had pierced the morning quiet moments before. Now, an even more impossible sound followed. Her voice. If you're excited to dive into this story, hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us share more amazing stories. And believe me, you won't want to miss them. Now, let's jump into the story. Karen Bell was born into a world of marble floors and bulletproof glass, the daughter of Ruben Bell, a name that made police commissioners sweat and judges reconsider their verdicts. But all his power, all his blood money, all his connections to the darkest corners of society couldn't give him the one thing he'd spent a decade praying for. The sound of his daughter's laughter, the echo of her calling his name, until a pregnant nurse with haunted eyes and a past she'd sworn to forget did what no specialist, no surgeon, no fortune could accomplish. She made the silent speak. But miracles, as Annabelle knew too well from her days in that cursed community clinic, always come with a price. And this miracle came with something that shouldn't exist. Something that writhed on the courtyard stones like a secret refusing to die. Something that glistened with both organic tissue and metallic shimmer. As Ruben Bell dropped to his knees before his daughter, hearing her voice for the first time, Annabelle's medical mind was already racing through the horrifying implications. She'd seen this before. She'd pulled these things from patients who died the next day. She'd quit medicine because of them. And now, one lay at her feet in the most dangerous place she could imagine, in front of a man who could make problems disappear with a phone call. But the real question wasn't what she'd removed. It was who had put it there, and why a dead woman's charity work and an underground fertility program held the answer to a little girl's stolen voice. But to understand how we arrived at this moment, tweezers extracting the impossible, a child speaking after a decade of silence, a pregnant woman risking everything. We must go back to the empire that silence built, to the mansion where grief echoed louder than gunfire, and to the man who thought he could control everything except his own daughter's fate. Ruben Bell was a contradiction wrapped in Italian wool and blood money. By night, he was the phantom that haunted the city's underworld, the man whose word could end careers, lives, and entire criminal operations with a single phone call. Police commissioners knew better than to investigate his businesses too closely. Judges learned to recognize when a case involved his interests. Even rival crime families whispered his name with a mixture of respect and fear, because Ruben Bell didn't just control territory. He controlled the very air people breathed in the darker corners of the city. But by dawn, when he returned to his marble fortress on the hill, he became something else entirely. A broken man who couldn't fix his own daughter. The Bell Mansion stood like a monument to beautiful suffering. 3 stories of architectural triumph, floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city he owned, gardens maintained by silent workers who knew better than to make unnecessary noise. The foyer alone cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. Imported marble from Carrara, crystal chandeliers from Vienna, art that museums had tried to buy. Yet for all its grandeur, the house felt like a mausoleum. Silence lived in every corner. Not the peaceful quiet of sanctuary, but the suffocating hush of grief that had settled into the walls 10 years ago and never left. Staff members moved through hallways like ghosts, communicating in whispers and gestures. Music was forbidden. Laughter felt like blasphemy. Even the grandfather clock in the library had been stopped. Its pendulum frozen mid-swing because its ticking reminded Ruben too much of time he couldn't get back. At the center of this fortress of quiet lived Karen Bell, 10 years old, dark hair like her mother's, eyes that held an intelligence and sadness no child should carry. She moved through her father's empire like a small ghost, communicating through sign language and written notes that only a handful of people could understand. Her tutors came and went on strict schedules. Her therapists followed protocols that never changed. Her bodyguards watched her from distances that felt both protective and imprisoning. She had never heard her own laughter, never heard a bedtime story read aloud, never heard her father tell her he loved her, though his eyes said it every time he looked at her. Ruben had spent millions trying to change that. Specialists from Johns Hopkins, Mayo Clinic, hospitals in Switzerland and Japan, they'd all examined Karen with their expensive equipment and prestigious degrees. The diagnosis was always the same: profound bilateral sensorineural hearing loss, cause unknown, prognosis permanent. Each failure carved deeper into Ruben's soul. He blamed himself. How could he not? His wife Lydia had died giving birth to Karen, hemorrhaged on the delivery table while he sat in the waiting room, pacing like a caged animal, powerless for the first time in his adult life. The doctors had tried everything, but sometimes medicine failed even the powerful. So Lydia died, and Karen lived, and Ruben became a father to a daughter he could never truly reach. He'd buried his grief the only way he knew how, by building his empire larger, stronger, more untouchable. Every territory he claimed, every deal he closed, every enemy he eliminated was another brick in the wall he'd built around his heart. His associates whispered that he'd become more ruthless after Lydia's death. They were right. Mercy felt like weakness when you couldn't save the person who mattered most. But late at night, when the city below glittered with lights from businesses and nightclubs he owned, Ruben would stand in Karen's doorway and watch her sleep. He'd imagine what her voice might sound like, wonder what she dreamed about in that silent world, question whether his sins had somehow cursed her. The doctor said her deafness wasn't genetic, wasn't his fault, but guilt doesn't care about medical facts. Then, 3 weeks ago, everything began to shift. Karen developed another ear infection, the third that year. The usual medical team was consulted, prescriptions written, treatment started. But when the infection worsened instead of improving, the mansion's head of staff suggested bringing in additional help. Someone to provide round-the-clock care until the crisis passed. That's when Annabelle Milton walked through the front doors of the Bell Mansion, 6 months pregnant and carrying a worn medical bag that had seen better days. She was nothing like the other medical professionals Ruben employed. No designer clothes or prestigious credentials displayed like armor. No careful deference or nervous energy that usually accompanied people entering his world. Just a young woman with tired eyes, practical shoes, and a gentleness that seemed out of place among the marble and muscle. The staff didn't know what to make of her. She hummed while she worked, soft, unconscious melodies that broke the mansion's sacred silence. She smiled at the bodyguards stationed outside Karen's room until their stern expressions cracked. She asked the cook about his grandmother's recipe, and actually listened to the answer. She moved through the fortress of grief like someone who'd forgotten to be afraid. And with Karen, she was different still. Where others treated the girl like fragile glass or a medical puzzle to solve, Annabelle treated her like a child. She sat on the floor during examinations instead of looming over her patient. She learned basic sign language within days and practiced it constantly, mistakes and all, until Karen's lips curved into something resembling a smile. She brought coloring books and puzzles, taught Karen to play simple card games, and once, to the horror of the security team, took her outside to feel the rain. She can't hear the thunder, Annabelle had explained calmly when questioned. But she can feel it. She deserves to experience storms. Ruben watched this transformation from a distance, unsure whether to be grateful or suspicious. This pregnant woman who'd appeared from nowhere, who worked for a fraction of what his specialist charged, who seemed to see his daughter as a person rather than a condition. Who was she really? But he couldn't deny what he saw. For the first time in years, Karen seemed happy. She'd started waiting by the window for Annabelle's arrival each morning, started showing her drawings and written notes she never shared with anyone else, started pressing her small hand against Annabelle's rounded belly, fascinated by the life growing inside. One evening, Ruben found them in the library. Annabelle was reading aloud from a picture book, pointless since Karen couldn't hear, but acting out the story with exaggerated expressions and gestures that made Karen's shoulders shake with silent laughter. He'd stood in the doorway, watching, and felt something crack inside his chest, something that felt dangerously close to hope. That night, he'd pulled Annabelle aside. "Why do you do that?" he asked. "Read to her when she can't hear you?" Annabelle had looked at him with those haunted eyes and said simply, "Because stories aren't just about words, Mr. Bell. They're about connection, and your daughter understands more than anyone gives her credit for." She'd walked away before he could respond, one hand resting on her pregnant belly too. And Ruben had wondered, not for the first time, what secrets she carried behind that gentle smile. He would find out soon enough. Because 3 days later, Karen would wake up screaming in pain, and Annabelle Milton would do something that would change everything. Annabelle Milton had learned to live with ghosts. They followed her through the pristine hallways of the Bell mansion, whispered to her in the quiet moments before sleep, and stared back at her from mirrors with accusations she could never quite silence. 5 months ago, she'd been a different person. Dr. Annabelle Milton, dedicated nurse practitioner at St. Jerome's Community Clinic, believer in the power of medicine to heal the broken. Now she was just Annabelle, pregnant, abandoned, and haunted by the memory of something that shouldn't have existed. The nightmares always started the same way. She's back at St. Jerome's, that crumbling clinic in the East End, where the fluorescent lights flickered like dying insects, and the waiting room smelled of desperation and disinfectant. The patients who came there were the forgotten ones. The people who fell through the cracks of a healthcare system that had no room for poverty. Annabelle had loved working there, had believed she was making a difference, until the ear cases started. First came Marcus Webb, a 42-year-old construction worker who complained of voices whispering in his left ear. Not loud enough to make out words, he'd said, but constant, like radio static shaped into language. The examination showed nothing unusual, no infection, no blockage, no obvious cause. But Annabelle had seen something, a shadow, a movement beneath the skin of his ear canal, so brief she'd convinced herself it was a trick of the light. Marcus died of a brain aneurysm 3 days later. Then came Sarah Chen, 17 years old, hearing phantom music that made her scream in the middle of the night. Then old Mr. Rodriguez, who swore his deceased wife was calling to him through his right ear. Then the teenager whose name Annabelle could never forget, Timothy, only 14, who'd stopped sleeping because the whispers wouldn't let him rest. Each time, Annabelle examined them. Each time, she caught glimpses of something dark moving where nothing should be. Each time, she told herself she was imagining things, that stress and exhaustion were playing tricks on her perception. Until Angela Morrison walked into the clinic, 26 years old, pregnant, like Annabelle would later become, crying because she heard her unborn baby screaming inside her head, even though ultrasounds showed the fetus was perfectly healthy. "Please," Angela had begged, gripping Annabelle's hand. "Please make it stop. I can't sleep. I can't eat. I hear it dying every second of every day." That night, Annabelle had stayed late, had taken out her otoscope and looked deeper than she'd ever dared before. And there, nestled in Angela's ear canal like a parasitic secret, she'd seen it clearly for the first time. Something black, thread-thin, moving with deliberate serpentine intelligence. Her hands had shaken as she'd reached for the tweezers. Every instinct screamed at her to stop, to call for help, to refer Angela to a specialist, but the woman's desperate eyes had held her in place. "Trust me," Annabelle had whispered. The extraction had taken 17 minutes. The longest 17 minutes of Annabelle's life. The organism had resisted, had seemed to burrow deeper even as she pulled, had writhed in her tweezers like something refusing to die. When it finally came free, it lay on the sterile tray, black, glistening, impossibly alive despite having no visible organs or structure. Angela had gasped. The voices stopped immediately. For one beautiful moment, silence filled the examination room. "Thank you," Angela had breathed. "Thank you, thank you, thank—" She never finished. Her eyes rolled back. Seizure, Annabelle had thought, reaching for her patient. But it wasn't a seizure. It was something else, something that made Angela's body arch and twist, and Angela Morrison died at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in October. Cause of death: catastrophic brain hemorrhage of unknown origin. Annabelle had tried to tell the attending physicians about the organism, had pointed to the tray where it had lain moments before, but the tray was empty. The thing had vanished, evaporated or crawled away, or simply ceased to exist. No one believed her. The autopsy showed nothing unusual except the hemorrhage. Angela's death was ruled a tragic coincidence. The organism became a figment of a stressed nurse's imagination, but Annabelle knew what she'd seen, knew what she'd removed, knew that her attempt to help had somehow caused a young woman's death. She'd quit medicine the next day. 3 weeks later, her husband Michael told her he was leaving. "I can't do this," he'd said, looking everywhere except at her pregnant belly. "I can't be a father. I can't be married to someone who's broken." He'd left her with half the rent paid and a note explaining that he'd never wanted children, that the pregnancy was her choice, that he hoped she'd understand. She'd understood perfectly. She was alone. The Bell job had been a last resort. Just temporary nursing care, the agency had said. Good pay, room and board if needed, medical care for her and the baby. She'd taken it because she had no other choice. Had walked into that marble fortress expecting to perform basic wound care and medication management. She hadn't expected Karen. The moment Annabelle saw the girl, dark-haired, silent, with eyes that held too much sadness, something had shifted inside her. This child wasn't just deaf. She was isolated, treated like a beautiful broken thing rather than a person. The staff tiptoed around her. The specialists examined her like a specimen. Even her father, despite his obvious love, kept an emotional distance that seemed born of helplessness. Annabelle couldn't fix Karen's deafness. but she could treat her like a child who deserved joy. So she'd learned sign language from YouTube videos watched late at night, brought crayons and paper because art didn't require hearing, sat on the floor during examinations because looking up at adults was frightening when you couldn't hear them coming, hummed while she worked because the vibrations made Karen curious rather than afraid. And slowly, beautifully, Karen had begun to trust her. The girl would wait by the window each morning, face lighting up when Annabelle arrived, would show her drawings of flowers and stars and a pregnant woman who looked suspiciously like Annabelle herself, would press her small hand against Annabelle's belly, fascinated by the kicks and movements of the life growing inside. For the first time since Angela Morrison's death, Annabelle felt like she was healing rather than breaking. Until yesterday, Karen had been sitting in the afternoon sunlight, drawing another picture when she'd scratched absently at her left ear. Just a casual gesture, the kind children make 1,000 times a day. But Annabelle had been watching, and in that moment, in that specific angle of light, she'd seen it. A shadow beneath Karen's skin, moving. Her blood had frozen. Her hands had trembled. No, she'd thought. Not again. Not here. Not this child. She'd made an excuse to examine Karen's ear, had used her otoscope with hands that shook despite her best efforts. And there, barely visible in the depths of the ear canal, she'd seen the confirmation that made her stomach drop. Something dark, thread-thin, alive. The same kind of organism she'd pulled from Angela Morrison's ear the night Angela died. That night, Annabelle stood in her small bathroom at the mansion's staff quarters, staring at her reflection in the mirror above the sink. She looked exhausted, hollowed out. Her hand rested on her pregnant belly, seeking comfort from the life inside her. In the mirror, her reflection stared back, and for just a moment seemed to twitch. Not her actual reflection moving, but something behind her eyes. A memory surfacing, Angela's face in those final moments. The black organism writhing in the tweezers. The empty tray where it had vanished. If I remove it from Karen, will she die too? The question hung in the air like a death sentence. But another question followed, more terrible still. If I don't remove it, what will it do to her? Annabelle closed her eyes, feeling tears slip down her cheeks. Her baby kicked against her palm, a reminder that she was responsible for more than just her own fear now. Tomorrow, she would have to make a choice. Tomorrow, she would have to decide whether to stay silent or risk everything to save a child who'd already stolen her heart. Tomorrow, she would have to become either a coward or the woman who got Angela Morrison killed. The mirror offered no answers. Only her haunted reflection, staring back with eyes that had seen too much and understood too little. The grandfather clock in Ruben Bell's study had been stopped at 3:47 a.m. for 10 years. The exact moment the hospital called to tell him his wife was gone. Now, at nearly midnight, Annabelle stood outside his door, listening to the silence that clock represented, and tried to find the courage to knock. Her hand trembled against the dark mahogany. Inside, she could hear the soft clink of crystal. Ruben pouring another drink, the way he did every night when he thought no one was watching. The way men drank when they were trying to drown something that refused to die. She knew that feeling intimately. Knock. 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 The sound echoed through the empty hallway like gunshots. Come in. His voice was cold, flat. The voice of a man who'd been interrupted during his only moment of vulnerability and wasn't pleased about it. Annabelle pushed open the door. Ruben Bell's study was exactly what she'd expected. Leather and darkness, walls lined with books that probably had never been read. A desk that looked like it cost more than most cars. He sat behind it, silhouetted against the city lights visible through floor-to-ceiling windows, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He didn't look like a mafia boss in that moment. He looked like what he was, a tired father at the end of another day of pretending he was fine. "Miss Milton." He didn't stand, didn't gesture for her to sit. "It's late. If this is about your schedule or—" "Your daughter's deafness," Annabelle interrupted, her voice steadier than she felt. "It might not be natural." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Ruben set down his glass with deliberate precision. "Excuse me?" There's something inside her ear. The words tumbled out now, desperate and urgent. Something that shouldn't be there. Something alive. "Get out." "Mr. Bell." "Please." "I said get out." He stood now, and the transformation was instant. The tired father vanished, replaced by the man whose name made police commissioners nervous. His eyes were chips of black ice. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but I'm not playing anything." Annabelle stepped forward, her hands instinctively moving to her pregnant belly. "I've seen this before. At my old clinic. Patients with ear problems, hearing voices, strange symptoms. And every time I looked close enough, I found something, an organism, a parasite, something that doesn't exist in any medical textbook." Ruben's jaw tightened. "So you're a faith healer now? Is that it? You think you can waltz into my home, gain my daughter's trust, and then sell me some miracle cure for the right price?" "No, I don't want money. I don't want credit. I just want— You want to experiment on my child." His voice dropped to a deadly whisper. "You want to play God with my daughter's life because you think you've discovered something the best doctors in the world missed?" "They did miss it," Annabelle's voice cracked. "Because they weren't looking for it. Because it's impossible. Because—" "Enough!" Ruben moved around the desk with the grace of a predator. "Do you know how many people have stood where you're standing? How many specialists and healers and miracle workers have promised me they could fix her? How many times I've let myself hope, only to watch my daughter suffer through another pointless treatment?" He was close now, close enough that Annabelle could see the rage burning beneath his controlled exterior. Close enough that she understood viscerally why people feared this man. "I've had priests tell me demons stole her hearing, acupuncturists who claim qi imbalances, homeopaths with their sugar pills and empty promises, even a woman who wanted to perform a spiritual cleansing that would have cost $500,000. His voice was acid. Every single one of them was a fraud. Every single one exploited my grief for profit. "I'm not them," Annabelle whispered. "No." Ruben's laugh was bitter. "Then what are you? A pregnant woman with a savior complex? Someone so desperate for purpose that you'll convince yourself you see monsters that don't exist?" The words hit like physical blows. Annabelle felt tears burning behind her eyes, but refused to let them fall. "The last patient I treated with this condition died," she said quietly. "Her name was Angela Morrison. She was 26 years old and pregnant, just like me. I removed the organism from her ear, and 3 minutes later, she hemorrhaged and died in my arms." Ruben's expression flickered, something almost like uncertainty crossing his features. "That's why I quit medicine," Annabelle continued. "That's why I swore never to touch another patient, because I don't understand what these things are or why they kill. But I saw one in your daughter's ear yesterday, and if I don't do something, you'll do nothing." Ruben's voice turned to steel. "You'll forget whatever you think you saw. You'll continue providing basic care until Karen's infection clears, and then you'll leave this house and never come back. Do you understand me?" "She could die." Annabelle's composure finally shattered. "If that thing is anything like the others I've seen, my daughter is not your redemption project." The roar was so sudden, so violent, that Annabelle stumbled backward. "You don't get to ease your guilt by risking her life. You don't get to play hero with the one person I have left." The study door opened. Ruben's right-hand man, a mountain of a man named Victor, who'd been with the family for 15 years, stood in the doorway, his expression carefully neutral. "Everything all right, boss?" "Miss Milton was just leaving." Ruben turned away, dismissing her with his back. "Make sure she understands that this conversation never happened." Victor's hand landed on Annabelle's shoulder. Not rough, but firm, guiding her toward the door. As they stepped into the hallway, he leaned close enough that his whispered words were for her alone. "Around here, curiosity can get you buried next to your patients. You understand what I'm saying?" It wasn't a threat. It was a warning, maybe even a kindness in its own way. Annabelle nodded numbly. She made it back to her quarters before the tears came. They poured out in great, gasping sobs, grief and frustration and fear all tangled together. She sank onto the narrow bed, her hands wrapped around her pregnant belly, feeling her baby kick and turn as if sensing her distress. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the life inside her. "I'm sorry I keep making terrible choices. I'm sorry I can't seem to save anyone, not even myself." Her baby kicked again, harder this time, as if arguing, as if insisting. Annabelle closed her eyes and saw Karen's face. That beautiful, silent, trusting face. Saw the shadow moving beneath her skin. Saw Angela Morrison's eyes rolling back as death took her. She couldn't save Angela. The guilt of that failure would haunt her forever. But Karen was still alive, still had a chance. If Annabelle did nothing, if she stayed quiet and safe and that organism killed Ruben Bell's daughter, could she live with herself? Could she look at her own child someday and explain that she'd chosen her own safety over saving a little girl? "Sometimes we must do what's right," she whispered to her unborn baby. "Even when the world calls it madness." Outside her window, the city glittered with lights from businesses Ruben Bell owned. An empire built on fear and power and control. But empires couldn't stop the things that lived in the dark, couldn't protect against the impossible, couldn't save a little girl who was running out of time. Tomorrow, Annabelle would have to choose: obey a man who could make her disappear, or trust her instincts and risk everything, her job, her safety, maybe her life, for a child who deserved to hear her father say, "I love you." She already knew which choice she'd make. The same choice Angela Morrison would have wanted her to make. The same choice her unborn child would hopefully understand someday. The right one, even if it destroyed her. She touched her belly one more time, feeling the warmth and movement beneath her palm, and tried to find the courage to face what was coming. Because in 3 days, Karen Bell would wake up screaming in pain, and Annabelle Milton would do the one thing Ruben Bell had forbidden. She would look closer. Dawn broke over the Bell mansion at 5:43 a.m., painting the marble floors in shades of gold and crimson. In another house, it might have been beautiful. Here, it looked like blood. The scream that shattered the morning quiet wasn't loud. Karen Bell had never learned to modulate her voice, had never heard herself make sound, but it carried a primal terror that sent guards running and set off every protective instinct in Annabelle's body. She was dressed and moving before conscious thought caught up, her hands already reaching for her medical bag as she ran down the hallway. Her pregnant belly made her clumsy, but fear gave her speed. Karen's door stood open. Inside, the girl writhed on her bed, clutching the left side of her head, her face contorted in agony. Silent tears streamed down her cheeks. A thin trickle of blood leaked from her ear, dark against her pale skin. "Karen, sweetheart, I'm here." Annabelle's hands were already moving, gently tilting the girl's head to examine the ear. "I'm here. It's okay, She saw it immediately. The organism had grown. What had been a thread-thin shadow 3 days ago was now visible even without the otoscope. A dark, writhing mass pressing against the ear canal's delicate skin, trying to burrow deeper. As she watched, it pulsed, moved with deliberate intention. It was killing her, right now, this moment. "Oh, God," Annabelle breathed. Karen's eyes found hers, wide, terrified, pleading. The girl couldn't hear Annabelle's words, couldn't hear her own screams, but she understood pain, understood fear, understood that something was very, very wrong. Annabelle's hands shook as she reached for her medical bag, pulled out the sterilization spray. The tweezers, the same ones she'd used on Angela Morrison, the ones she'd sworn never to use again. "I'm sorry," she thought to the memory of Angela. "I'm sorry, but I have to try." "Miss Milton, step away from the child." The voice was cold, commanding. Annabelle turned to find 3 bodyguards in the doorway, hands on their weapons. Behind them, staff members clustered, the head housekeeper, Karen's tutor, others whose names she'd never learned. "She's in pain," Annabelle said, forcing her voice to stay calm. "There's something in her ear that needs to come out, now." "The doctors have been called. You are not to touch her." "The doctors won't arrive in time." Annabelle turned back to Karen, began sterilizing the tweezers with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. "Whatever this is, it's getting worse. If I don't—" "What the hell is going on here?" Ruben Bell's roar filled the room like thunder. He shoved past his guards, still dressed in yesterday's clothes, eyes wild with the panic of a father who'd heard his child screaming. When he saw Karen, trembling, bleeding, terrified, something broke across his face. "Karen, baby, I'm here. Papa's here." He reached for her, then froze when he saw Annabelle with the tweezers in her hand. His expression transformed from fear to fury in an instant. "You! Get away from my daughter!" "Mr. Bell, please!" "I warned you." His voice dropped to that deadly whisper. "I told you what would happen if you touched her." "Sir?" One of the guards drew his weapon. The metallic click of the safety disengaging was obscenely loud in the sudden silence. "Should I—" "Ruben, look at her!" Annabelle's voice cracked. She pointed to Karen's ear, where blood now flowed more freely, where the dark mass beneath the skin was visible even from across the room. "Look at what's happening! Your daughter is dying right now while you threaten me!" Ruben's eyes moved to Karen, saw the blood, saw his daughter's terrified face, saw something he couldn't explain writhing beneath her skin. "The doctors will be too late." Annabelle met his gaze, and in that moment, she let him see everything, her fear, her guilt, her absolute certainty. "I've seen this before. I know what happens if we wait. Please, Ruben. Please let me try. She'd never used his first name before. The intimacy of it, the raw humanity, seemed to cut through his rage like a knife. For 3 eternal seconds, he said nothing. Karen whimpered, a sound she couldn't hear herself make. If you hurt her, Ruben whispered, if you're wrong about this, I will destroy you. Do you understand? Not just you. Everyone you've ever loved. Everyone who... I understand. Annabelle was already turning back to Karen, already positioning the tweezers. Hold her still. Ruben moved to the bed, gathered his daughter against his chest. Karen's hands clutched his shirt, her small body shaking. Over her head, his eyes met Annabelle's, a father's desperate prayer wrapped in a killer's promise. Save her or die. The world narrowed to the point of the tweezers. Annabelle leaned in close, her pregnant belly pressing against the bed, her breath fogging the metal instruments. Karen's ear canal stretched before her like a tunnel into darkness. At its end, the organism waited. I'm sorry, sweetheart, she whispered, knowing Karen couldn't hear. This is going to hurt. The tweezers slid into the ear canal with a sound like metal scraping bone. Karen's body went rigid. Ruben's arms tightened around her, his own breath coming in ragged gasps. Annabelle's hands steadied. Muscle memory took over. Years of medical training, hundreds of procedures, the ghost of Angela Morrison guiding her movements, deeper, carefully. The organism was close now. She could feel the tweezers brushing against it. It moved, tried to retreat deeper into Karen's skull. No, you don't, Annabelle breathed. Not this time. She adjusted her grip, angled the tweezers, and closed them around the organism's writhing body. The resistance was immediate and horrifying. The thing fought like it was alive, like it understood what was happening and refused to let go. Annabelle pulled gently, steadily, feeling it resist every millimeter. Karen screamed, a sound of pure agony that she'd never heard before, but somehow knew how to make. Almost there, Annabelle whispered. Sweat dripped down her face. Almost. Something tore. Not flesh, something else. A connection breaking. The organism came free in a sudden rush, and Annabelle stumbled backward, the tweezers held high like a trophy. Silence crashed over the room. The organism writhed in the metal grip, black, thread thin, impossibly alive. But unlike the others Annabelle had seen, this one had something else. A shimmer, a metallic gleam that caught the dawn light and reflected it like oil on water. It wasn't entirely biological. Part of it was machine. Annabelle's mind raced, but she had no time to process because... Karen gasped. The sound was soft, delicate. The first breath taken by someone who'd just been underwater. Her eyes went wide. Her hands released their death grip on her father's shirt. Her head tilted, and her expression transformed into something between wonder and terror. What? Her voice was barely a whisper, unpracticed and uncertain, the voice of someone who'd never heard their own words. What is that sound? The room seemed to stop breathing. Karen? Ruben's voice broke. Karen, can you... The girl's head snapped toward him, her eyes filled with tears. Her lips trembled as she formed a word she'd only ever seen in sign language, never heard, never spoken. Papa? The sound of her voice, small and uncertain and absolutely real, shattered something fundamental in the universe. Ruben Bell, the man who controlled an empire, who'd never shown weakness in 30 years of brutal business, collapsed to his knees. His arms wrapped around his daughter, and for the first time since his wife died, he wept. "Yes," he sobbed into her hair. "Yes, baby. It's Papa. I'm here. I'm here." "I can hear you," Karen whispered, wonder and fear mixing in her voice. "Papa, I can hear you." Annabelle stumbled backward, her legs finally giving out. She sank into a chair, the tweezers still clutched in her shaking hand. The organism writhed one more time, then went still. She let it fall. It hit the marble floor with a sound like metal on stone. Lay there twitching, neither fully alive nor completely dead. In the dawn light streaming through the windows, its metallic shimmer was unmistakable. This wasn't natural, wasn't biological, wasn't anything that should exist. Someone had made this, put it in Karen, stolen a little girl's hearing for a reason Annabelle couldn't begin to understand. Around her, the guards were lowering their weapons. The staff members were crying. Ruben was still on his knees, holding his daughter, listening to her voice for the first time. And Annabelle Milton, pregnant and exhausted and terrified, looked down at the impossible thing on the floor and realized something that made her blood run cold. This was just the beginning. The first camera crew arrived at 7:32 a.m. By noon, Bell Industries was under siege. News vans lined the street outside the mansion's gates. Their satellite dishes pointed skyward like mechanical flowers seeking sun. Reporters shouted questions at anyone who entered or left. Helicopters circled overhead, their cameras trained on the courtyard where, just hours ago, a miracle had occurred. Sources confirm that Karen Bell, daughter of alleged crime boss Ruben Bell, spoke for the first time this morning. Pregnant nurse removed an unknown object from the child's ear. Medical community calling it impossible? Questions about what exactly was extracted and whether Ruben stood at his study window, watching the chaos unfold below, and felt control slipping through his fingers like water. In 30 years of running an empire built on secrets and silence, he'd never lost control of a narrative. Information was currency, and he'd always been the richest man in the room. Until today. Someone had leaked. Someone always leaked. And now the world wanted answers he didn't have. Behind him, Karen sat on the leather sofa, her hands pressed over her ears. Not to block out pain, but to block out everything. Sound. The concept that had been theoretical her entire life was now overwhelming reality. Every footstep in the hallway made her flinch. Every distant voice made her head turn. The grandfather clock's stopped pendulum had been her favorite place to sit because of its silence. Now silence was the one thing she couldn't find. "Make them go away," she whispered, her voice still uncertain, still learning its own cadence. "Papa, please make them stop." Ruben's heart cracked. He'd prayed for 10 years to hear his daughter's voice. Now her first request was for the quiet she'd always known. "I will, baby. I promise." But he didn't know if that was a promise he could keep anymore. The organism lay in a hermetically sealed container in the mansion's medical suite, surrounded by equipment that had cost more than most people's homes. 3 doctors, the best Ruben's money could buy, stood around it like priests examining a cursed relic. Dr. Sarah Chen, molecular biologist from Stanford, spoke first. Her voice carried the careful neutrality of someone delivering impossible news. "The preliminary analysis is contradictory. She pulled up images on the wall-mounted screen, microscopic views of the organism's structure. Biologically, it has characteristics consistent with parasitic nematodes, cellular structure, protein markers, even reproductive capability. But, Ruben's voice was ice. But approximately 30% of its mass is synthetic. Dr. Chen zoomed in on a cross-section. Thin metallic fibers ran through the organism's body like circuitry through flesh. These aren't naturally occurring. They're manufactured, nanoscale metallic alloys interwoven with organic tissue at the cellular level. What does that mean? Annabelle stood in the corner, arms wrapped around her pregnant belly, trying to make sense of the impossible. It means someone made this. Dr. Marcus Webb, the neurologist, stepped forward. His hands shook slightly as he manipulated the images. Someone designed an organism that could interface with human neural tissue. The metallic components appear to conduct electrical signals, essentially hijacking the auditory nerve pathway. It was blocking her hearing, Annabelle breathed. Not damage, not deafness, interference. Precisely. Dr. Chen's expression was grim. This wasn't a disease or a mutation. It was deliberate. Someone implanted this in your daughter, Mr. Bell, and programmed it to prevent auditory signals from reaching her brain. The silence that followed was absolute. Ruben's mind raced through possibilities, each more horrifying than the last. Someone had done this to Karen. Someone had stolen his daughter's hearing on purpose. Someone had... When? His voice was barely controlled fury. When was it implanted? Based on the organism's development and integration with surrounding tissue. Dr. Webb hesitated. Gestation. Possibly even embryonic stage. This has been inside her since before she was born. The floor seemed to tilt beneath Ruben's feet. That's impossible, he whispered. Lydia was healthy. Every prenatal test came back normal. He stopped. Because he was remembering something. A clinical trial Lydia had been so excited about. An experimental fertility program for high-risk pregnancies. She'd had complications early on, bleeding, pain, and they'd recommended she join a research study. State-of-the-art care, they'd promised. The best monitoring available. He'd signed the consent forms without reading them, too busy with business, too confident in his money's ability to protect what mattered. Find everything, he said quietly, the words vibrating with barely contained violence. Every doctor who treated my wife during her pregnancy, every clinic she visited, every goddamn piece of paper with her name on it. I want to know who touched her, who examined her, who had access. Mr. Bell? Annabelle's voice cut through his rage. The patients at my clinic. The ones with the organisms. I've been thinking about where they came from. She pulled out her phone with trembling hands, scrolled through old photos she'd kept despite deleting everything else from St. Jerome's. Patient files she'd photographed before quitting. Evidence she'd collected without really knowing why. They all had one thing in common, she continued. They were all born at or adopted through the same place. Mercy Hills Orphanage. She looked up, her eyes meeting Ruben's. The orphanage your wife founded, the one she funded and managed until she died. Ruben's voice was hollow. The pieces were connecting, a pattern emerging from chaos. Lydia's charitable work, the orphanage, the fertility program, Karen's implant, the other victims, all of it spiraling back to his wife, to a woman he'd loved and lost and thought he'd known. She didn't know, Annabelle said softly. Your wife didn't know what they were doing. She couldn't have. But Ruben wasn't sure anymore. wasn't sure of anything. His entire world, built on certainty and control, was crumbling, and he couldn't tell truth from deception anymore. That evening, after the doctors left and the media circus continued outside, and Karen finally fell into exhausted sleep, Ruben found Annabelle in the courtyard. She sat on a stone bench, one hand on her belly, staring at the spot where the organism had landed hours ago. "You saved her." His voice startled her. "I didn't say it before. I should have. You saved my daughter's life." Annabelle shook her head. "I don't know if I saved her or just delayed something worse. Angela Morrison, the woman I told you about, she died after I removed hers." "What if Karen—" "Stop!" Ruben sat beside her, and for the first time since she'd known him, he looked human, vulnerable. "What if doesn't matter? You gave her a voice. You gave me—" His voice broke. "You gave me the sound of my daughter saying my name. Whatever happens next, I'll have that." They sat in silence for a moment, two broken people connected by a miracle they didn't understand. "I'm scared," Annabelle whispered. "The organism disappeared from the hospital after Angela died. Someone took it, and now this one exists. Documented, photographed. What if whoever made these things comes looking for it?" "Let them come." Ruben's voice hardened back into the man who'd built an empire on fear. "I'll be waiting." But his hand, when he reached out to steady Annabelle's trembling shoulder, was gentle, protective. "We'll figure this out," he promised. "Together. Because whoever did this to my daughter, to your patients, they're going to answer for it. Every single one." Above them, the helicopters continued to circle. Below them, in secure storage, the organism lay preserved. And somewhere in the city, in files and records spanning 10 years, the truth waited to be uncovered. A truth about experiments and orphanages, and a woman named Lydia Bell who died before she could warn anyone about what she'd discovered. A truth that would lead them into darkness deeper than either could imagine. But for now, in the courtyard where a miracle had occurred, two people who'd both lost everything found something unexpected. Each other. And the courage to face what came next. The files arrived at midnight in 3 unmarked boxes, delivered by men who didn't give names and didn't wait for signatures. Annabelle found them outside her quarters, manila folders and digital drives containing a decade of secrets that Ruben's network had extracted from locked cabinets, encrypted servers, and places that officially didn't exist. She carried them to the library where Ruben already sat surrounded by documents, his eyes hollow from sleeplessness and something darker. "Tell me I'm wrong," he said without looking up. "Tell me what I'm reading isn't real." Annabelle opened the first folder. Inside, she found brochures printed on expensive paper, the kind that whispered wealth and exclusivity. The language was careful, clinical. Neurological optimization, cognitive enhancement, sensory refinement, pretty words that promised wealthy parents something priceless. Perfect children, smarter, stronger, better. "Lydia was part of this," Annabelle said, her voice barely above a whisper. She held up a consent form bearing Lydia Bell's signature. She enrolled in the program during her first trimester. "She told me it was prenatal monitoring." Ruben's hand shook as he pulled another document from the pile. "Advanced care for high-risk pregnancies. I thought I was protecting her, protecting Karen." His laugh was broken glass. "I thought my money could buy safety." Annabelle kept reading, and with each page, the horror deepened. The Genesis Enhancement Program wasn't about prenatal vitamins and extra ultrasounds. It was about fundamental alteration. The documents described introducing biomechanical organisms into the developing fetus, nanoparasites designed to interface with neural pathways, to tune brain development like adjusting frequencies on a radio. The theory was ambitious. Children whose brains could process information faster, hear frequencies beyond normal human range, see colors others couldn't perceive. The next evolution of humanity, available only to those who could afford the seven-figure price tag. The reality was butchery. Trial summaries filled page after page with clinical descriptions of failure. Subject 23. Stillborn. Subject 31. Severe brain hemorrhage, deceased at 6 weeks. Subject 47. Catastrophic seizures, life support withdrawn. Subject 52. Profound sensory deprivation, cause unknown. Subject 52. Karen Bell. They didn't make her better, Annabelle breathed. They broke her. The organism was supposed to enhance her hearing, but instead it blocked everything, like installing a lock when they meant to open a door. How many? Ruben's voice was ice over lava. How many children did they? 43 documented trials. Annabelle pulled up a spreadsheet on one of the digital drives. 21 resulted in death. 18 in severe disabilities. 4 went into the program, but the organisms failed to implant. Only Karen survived to... She stopped. Because she'd found something else. The funding trail. Shell corporations layered like Russian dolls, each one buried inside another. Companies with innocuous names, Bright Future Holdings, Tomorrow's Promise LLC, Next Gen Medical Investments, all leading back to a parent organization. Bell Medical Holdings, Ruben's company. No. The word fell from his lips like a prayer denied. No, I didn't know. But the documents didn't lie. His signature appeared on investment authorizations. His money had flowed through those shell corporations straight into the Genesis Enhancement Program, into the research that had destroyed his own daughter. You couldn't have known, Annabelle said desperately. These companies, you own hundreds of investments. You couldn't possibly track every... I paid them. Ruben stood abruptly, his chair crashing backward. I paid them to torture my child. I gave them the money to experiment on infants, on Lydia's baby, on... His voice cracked. God help me. I funded my own daughter's destruction. He stumbled to the window, one hand pressed against the glass as if he might fall through it. When he spoke again, his voice was raw with realization. That's why they chose us. That's why they recruited Lydia. Not because she was high risk. Because I was wealthy, connected, someone who'd never questioned his own investments. He laughed bitterly. They knew I was too arrogant, too busy building my empire to notice I was funding their atrocities. They used my money and my wife and my ignorance to... Ruben! Annabelle stood, moved toward him. This wasn't your fault. They manipulated... Wasn't it? He turned, and his eyes were devastated. Every doctor I dismissed as a fraud, every treatment I refused to try. What if some of them could have helped? What if I was so focused on my pride, on proving I could fix this myself, that I missed you were a father trying to protect his child? I was a criminal who thought his money could buy anything. Ruben's voice dropped to a whisper. And it did. It bought suffering for my daughter, for all those other children, for families I'll never know. He looked at his hands as if seeing blood there. I'm not the victim here, Annabelle. I'm the villain. Before Annabelle could respond, Ruben's phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen, and his expression transformed from grief to cold fury. What is it? The organism. His voice was deadly quiet. The sample we had in the medical suite, it's gone. Gone? How? Security footage for the past 6 hours has been erased. Professional job. Whoever took it knew exactly what they were doing. He was already moving, already barking orders into his phone. Full lockdown. Check every person who entered or left. Pull backup footage. I want... But Annabelle wasn't listening, because she'd just turned the page on another document, and what she saw made her blood run cold. A photograph. Doctors in surgical masks surrounding an operating table, and in the background, partially obscured but unmistakable, a logo, a medical foundation, Mercy Hills Orphanage Medical Research Division, the orphanage Lydia had founded, the place where all of Annabelle's clinic patients had been born. "Ruben," she whispered. The orphanage, it wasn't charity, it was a testing ground. His voice was hollow with understanding. Children no one would miss, parents too poor to ask questions. The perfect subjects for experiments too dangerous to run on wealthy clients' children. They stared at each other across the library. Two people who'd just glimpsed the true scope of the horror. This wasn't just about Karen. It was about dozens, maybe hundreds of children. And somewhere, the people responsible were still operating, still experimenting, still. They took the organism, Annabelle said slowly, because it's evidence, proof that the program existed. Which means they're scared. Ruben's expression shifted into something predatory. Which means they're still out there, still watching. He looked down at the files scattered across the desk. His wife's signature, his company's money, his daughter's suffering, and made a decision. "Find them all," he said quietly. "Every doctor, every investor, every person who touched this program. I don't care how powerful they are or who they're connected to." His eyes were black fire. "By the time I'm done, they'll wish they'd never heard the name Bell." Outside, storm clouds gathered over the city, and somewhere in the darkness, someone who'd stolen evidence was making a phone call, warning others that secrets were coming to light. The conspiracy had survived 10 years in shadow, but now it had been seen, named, hunted. And Ruben Bell had just declared war. The war began at 2 a.m. Ruben Bell sat at the head of his conference table, surrounded by men who'd helped him build an empire on blood and silence. But tonight, the men he'd called weren't soldiers. They were accountants, lawyers, hackers, the kind who could dismantle empires with keystrokes and subpoenas. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, sliding folders across the polished surface. "Tonight, we clean our sins. Inside each folder, names, addresses, bank accounts. The architects of the Genesis Enhancement Program, laid bare. Dr. Marcus Heinrich, lead researcher. Senator Patricia Grayson, silent investor. Judge William Corso, who'd buried evidence. 17 others whose wealth and power had convinced them they were untouchable. By morning," Ruben continued, his voice carrying the cold certainty of judgment, "I want their accounts frozen, their credentials revoked, their secrets exposed. I want the world to know what they did to children, to my child." "Boss," Victor spoke carefully, "some of these people, they're connected. Federal judges, board members. This kind of exposure could blow back on..." "Let it," Ruben stood. "I've spent 30 years protecting myself. Tonight, I protect everyone else." The men exchanged glances, then nodded. Within minutes, the room filled with the clicking of keyboards and murmured phone calls. An empire turning its weapons inward, burning itself clean. But Ruben's mind was elsewhere, on a pregnant woman who'd risked everything for a child that wasn't hers, On the daughter who could finally hear him say, "I love you." On a wife who died never knowing she'd been part of an experiment. On the moment when power stopped being about control and became about protection. The men came for Annabelle at dawn. She was in her quarters, packing medical supplies with shaking hands, when her door exploded inward. 3 figures in black tactical gear, their faces hidden, their movements professional. One grabbed her arm, another pressed something cold against her neck, a syringe. "Where is it?" The voice was distorted by a modulator. "Where's the organism?" I don't have it." The syringe pressed harder. "Last chance, the sample. Where?" The window shattered. Victor came through like a wrecking ball, his massive frame tackling the nearest attacker. Gunfire erupted, silenced but deadly. Annabelle screamed, one hand instinctively covering her pregnant belly as Victor fought with brutal efficiency. "Go!" he roared, throwing one attacker through the doorway. "Safe house! Now!" Annabelle ran. The safe house was a penthouse apartment in a building Ruben owned under a name that didn't exist. Annabelle huddled in the bedroom, curtains drawn, her phone clutched in trembling hands. Every sound made her flinch. Every shadow held threats. Her baby kicked, as if sensing her terror. "I'm sorry," she whispered to her belly. "I'm so sorry I brought you into this." The door opened. Annabelle grabbed the lamp beside the bed, ready to fight, then sagged with relief when she saw Ruben's face. "Are you hurt?" He crossed to her in 3 strides, his hands checking for injuries with surprising gentleness. "No, but Victor is fine. 3 broken ribs, but he's handled worse." Ruben's jaw tightened. "They came for you because you're the only witness who can testify. You and Karen. Everyone else who knew about the program is either dead or complicit." "Then we go to the police. The police are bought." Ruben's voice was bitter. "Half the judges, too. This goes deeper than I thought, but I found something." He pulled out a tablet, showing her an address. "The lab, where they conducted the final experiments. It's still operational." Annabelle's eyes widened. "They're still doing this? Still?" "Not for long." The laboratory was hidden beneath a medical research facility, accessible only through coded elevators and biometric scanners that Ruben's hackers had cracked within minutes. They descended into fluorescent-lit corridors that smelled of antiseptic and secrets. Dr. Marcus Heinrich was waiting in the central lab, surrounded by equipment and files, burning evidence in a medical incinerator. He looked up as they entered, his expression shifting from surprise to resignation. "Mr. Bell." His voice was steady. "I wondered when you'd find us." "You experimented on my daughter." Ruben's words were knives. "I tried to enhance her." Heinrich gestured to screens displaying neural scans and frequency charts. "The goal was never deafness. We were creating children who could hear beyond normal range, ultrasonic frequencies, subsonic vibrations. Imagine the applications. Military, intelligence, a new evolution of, you tortured children." Annabelle stepped forward, her voice shaking with fury. 21 died. You destroyed families. You acceptable losses for advancement. Heinrich's clinical detachment was chilling. Besides, most were orphans, no one to miss them. Your daughter was unfortunate. The organism malfunctioned, blocked signals instead of enhancing them. But the data we gathered was invaluable. Ruben's gun was out before Annabelle registered the movement. "Give me one reason not to end you." "Because I'm not the only one." Heinrich smiled. "This program has sponsors in 12 countries. military applications, corporate espionage. You can't stop what's already... Fire alarms shrieked. Flames erupted from the incinerator, spreading faster than natural. Accelerant, Annabelle realized. Heinrich had triggered it deliberately. No evidence, no crime, Heinrich shouted over the roar, already running for the exit. The files. Annabelle spotted a cabinet marked Active Subjects, Karen's name visible on one folder. She lunged for it as flames reached the ceiling, as smoke filled her lungs, as Ruben's voice screamed for her to leave it. Her fingers closed around the folder. Then the ceiling collapsed. Ruben pulled her from the rubble, his body shielding hers from falling debris. They stumbled into the elevator as the lab became an inferno behind them. Annabelle clutched the folder, coughing smoke, her free hand on her belly where her baby still kicked. Still alive. Both of them still alive. Got it, she gasped, holding up the scorched folder. Proof. Karen's records. Everything. Ruben looked at her. Pregnant, covered in ash, having nearly died for evidence, and something in his expression broke open. You're insane, he whispered. I learned from the best. Above them, the building burned, and in Annabelle's hands, the truth survived. 6 months later, laughter echoed through the Bell mansion for the first time in a decade. It was Karen's laughter, bright and unrestrained, the sound of a child discovering joy she'd never known existed. She sat in the garden with Annabelle's daughter, Emma, teaching the infant sign language even though Emma was too young to understand. Karen's hands moved with practiced grace, her voice narrating each gesture. This means love, she explained, her words clear now, confident. And this means friend. I learned them when I couldn't hear, but now I can teach them to Emma so she knows both languages. Annabelle watched from the stone bench, her 3-month-old daughter sleeping against her chest. The weight of Emma in her arms still felt like a miracle, proof that terror and fire hadn't stolen everything, that life persisted even in the aftermath of darkness. She's patient with her, Ruben said, settling beside Annabelle. His voice had changed over these months, softer, the edges worn smooth by something that looked like peace. Karen knows what it's like to live in a different world, Annabelle replied. She's teaching Emma that different doesn't mean less. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the children. The mansion had transformed along with its owner. Music now played in the halls. Staff members smiled. The stopped grandfather clock had been wound and set ticking again. Time, it seemed, had permission to move forward. Ruben Bell was no longer the phantom that haunted the city's underworld. The trials had seen to that. 17 convictions, including a senator and 2 judges, all connected to the Genesis Enhancement Program. Ruben's testimony, delivered with brutal honesty about his own unknowing complicity, had made headlines for weeks. Some called it redemption. Others called it weakness. Ruben called it payment for sins he couldn't undo. The foundation opens next month, he said, breaking the silence. The Lydia Bell and Emma Milton Center for Pediatric Hearing Disorders. 3 facilities, free care for any child who needs it. Lydia would be proud. Annabelle's voice was soft. And Emma will be, when she's old enough to understand. Will you tell her about what happened? Annabelle looked down at her sleeping daughter. Someday, when she's ready to understand that her mother was terrified and reckless and did something impossibly dangerous because a little girl deserved to hear her father's voice. You did more than that. Ruben's hand found hers, squeezed gently. You saved me from becoming the monster I was building. You showed me what courage actually looks like. Before Annabelle could respond, Karen appeared before them, her expression curious in the way only children can achieve, completely unguarded, seeking truth. Annabelle? She sat cross-legged on the grass. Can I ask you something? Of course, sweetheart. That thing you pulled out of my ear. Karen's fingers touched the side of her head unconsciously. What was it? Really? Annabelle and Ruben exchanged glances. They'd rehearsed this conversation, knowing it would come eventually. But rehearsal couldn't prepare you for a child's eyes seeking answers to questions that had no good ones. Something that didn't belong to you anymore, Annabelle said softly, using the words they'd agreed upon. Something people put there by mistake, that was stopping you from being who you were meant to be. But there were others, Karen said. Other kids who had them. I heard you and Papa talking. Too smart, this child. Too perceptive. Yes, Annabelle admitted. There were others. Did you save them too? The question hung in the air like a prayer. Annabelle thought of Angela Morrison, of the patients at St. Jerome's, of the 21 children who died during the experiments, of the files that suggested other programs might still exist, hidden deeper, better protected. I saved the ones I could, she said finally. And your father is making sure no one else can hurt children that way again. Karen nodded slowly, processing this. Then, with the resilience of youth, she smiled. Good, because Emma's going to need protecting when she's bigger, and I'm going to help. She ran back to where the infant lay, resuming her sign language lesson with renewed determination. Annabelle watched her go, feeling tears prick her eyes. She's going to be extraordinary, Ruben murmured. She already is. That evening, as sunset painted the city in shades of gold and crimson, Annabelle stood in the mansion's library with Emma in her arms. The walls still held some of the files from that terrible night of discovery, evidence they couldn't completely destroy, ghosts they couldn't entirely exorcise. Ruben found her there, understanding without words what she was thinking. You think there are more, he said. Not a question. I know there are. Annabelle's voice was haunted. Dr. Heinrich's program had sponsors in 12 countries. We shut down one lab, but the others are probably still operating. Ruben's jaw tightened. Still experimenting? Still? Yes. They stood together, two people bound by shared trauma and impossible victory, staring at evidence of atrocities they'd only partially stopped. Emma stirred in Annabelle's arms, made a small sound, and settled back into sleep. We can't save everyone, Ruben said quietly. No, Annabelle agreed, but we saved one. And sometimes, she looked at Karen through the doorway, watched the girl who could finally hear her own laughter. Sometimes one is enough to matter. The Mafia boss's daughter was born deaf, until a woman with life inside her pulled out something mysterious, and the impossible spoke. Not all miracles descend from heaven wrapped in light. Some crawl out of darkness, born from desperate courage and the refusal to accept that money or power or fear can defeat love. Sometimes the impossible becomes real because someone pregnant and terrified and haunted by past failures chooses to look closer when everyone else looks away. Sometimes redemption isn't about erasing sins, but about standing in their light and choosing differently. And sometimes, just sometimes, a little girl's voice saying, "Papa," is enough to change the world. In the garden, Karen's laughter rang out again. Ruben closed his eyes and listened, really listened, to the sound he'd thought he'd never hear. And for the first time in 10 years, he smiled. Sometimes miracles are not gifts from heaven, but acts of courage born in darkness.